There's something about twins that has always unsettled people, something that goes deeper than shared faces or mirrored movements. Maybe it's the idea that two people can exist as reflections of each other, connected by something invisible and unexplainable. Throughout history, twins have fascinated, frightened, and confused us, and in some cases, they've done things so strange, so dark, and so inexplicable that science still doesn't have answers. These are some of the creepiest twin cases ever recorded. In the small seaside town of Haverfordwest, tucked into the southwestern coast of Wales, there was a house on a quiet street where two girls lived in a world that no one else could enter. Their names were June and Jennifer Gibbons, and from the time they were very young, they refused to speak to anyone but each other. To the outside world, they were silent. To each other, they were everything. June and Jennifer were born on the 11th of April, 1963, at a military hospital in Aden, Yemen, where their father Aubrey had been deployed with the Royal Air Force. Their parents, Aubrey and Gloria, were Caribbean immigrants who had come to the United Kingdom from Barbados as part of the Windrush generation in the early 1960s. Gloria was a housewife, Aubrey a technician, and the couple had 5 children in total, 3 other siblings alongside the twins. After several moves around England, the family eventually settled in Haverfordwest, Wales in 1974. It was here that the twins' silence truly took hold. Even before Wales, June, and Jennifer had been different. They were late to talk, and when they finally did speak, their words came out garbled, fast, and unintelligible to everyone around them. Their speech was described as sounding like a tape recorder playing at double speed, with occasional recognizable English words leaping out of the stream. No one could understand them, not their parents, not their teachers, not their siblings. It was as though the twins had built a wall of sound around themselves that only they could penetrate. Some experts would later characterize their speech as an example of cryptophagia, a private language shared exclusively between a set of twins, though June herself would later dispute this, insisting they had simply been speaking English, with a severe speech impediment rooted in a mix of Bajan Creole and the various dialects they had absorbed through their nomadic childhood. Whatever the explanation, the effect was the same. The twins were isolated. In Haverfordwest, they were the only black children in their school, and the bullying was relentless. Administrators eventually began dismissing the girls early each day just to help them avoid the worst of it. June and Jennifer responded to this cruelty the way they responded to everything, by retreating further into each other. They stopped speaking entirely to anyone outside their bond. Their parents would sometimes hear them chattering away behind their closed bedroom door, but the moment anyone approached, the voices stopped. When a doctor came to give the girls their tuberculosis vaccinations in 1976, he noticed something that troubled him. Neither girl flinched at the needle, and they moved in perfect synchronicity, like two halves of the same organism. He referred them to a child psychologist, and from there to a speech therapist at Withybush Hospital named Anne Treharne. Treharne was the first person to make any real headway with the twins. She recorded them speaking when they believed they were alone, and what she found was that their private language, while rapid and near incomprehensible, was built on a foundation of English and Bajan Creole spoken at extraordinary speed. But the revelation didn't change anything. June and Jennifer remained sealed off. Authorities tried separating them, sending each to a different boarding school in the hope that isolation from each other would force them to connect with the wider world. The opposite happened. Without Jennifer, June became catatonic. She lay in bed, refused to eat, and ignored everyone around her. Jennifer fared no better. When the experiment was abandoned and the twins were reunited, they withdrew even further. What the outside world didn't know was that behind their silence, the twins were furiously creative. Locked in their bedroom, they had taught themselves to write, filling exercise books with stories, novels, and diary entries of astonishing emotional depth. June wrote a novel called The Pepsi-Cola Addict, and Jennifer penned several works, including The Pugilist, about a doctor who transplants his family dog's heart into his dying child, only to be haunted by the dog's vengeful spirit. They used their unemployment benefits to pay a vanity press to publish June's novel. They dreamed of literary fame and recognition, of the world finally seeing what they had been building in silence all along. But there was a darkness beneath the creativity. Their diaries reveal a relationship that was as much a prison as it was a sanctuary. June once wrote that there was a murderous gleam in Jennifer's eye, and that she was scared of her. Jennifer wrote similar things about June. They were bound together by love and by something more suffocating, a mutual dependence so total that it left no room for individual identity. They played strange games of control, mirroring each other's movements, testing each other's loyalty, and punishing each other for perceived betrayals with prolonged silences that could last for days. In 1981, the pressure finally exploded outward. Over the course of several weeks, June and Jennifer went on a crime spree that included arson, petty theft, and vandalism. They set fire to at least 3 buildings. It was the only time their inner turmoil manifested as outward destruction, and it brought them to the attention of the criminal justice system. They were charged, and at their trial, they were brought into the courtroom like objects, carried in by wardens while they hung limp and expressionless, their eyes downcast and their hands dangling at their sides. The court deemed them mentally ill and sentenced them to indefinite detention at Broadmoor, Britain's most notorious high-security psychiatric hospital. They would spend 11 years there. Inside Broadmoor, the twins were heavily medicated, and their health and spirits deteriorated. The journalist Marjorie Wallace, who had first written about the twins for the Sunday Times and who would later publish a book about them called The Silent Twins, became their most frequent visitor and the closest thing they had to a lifeline to the outside world. It was during these visits that the twins revealed something that would haunt everyone who heard it. They had made a pact. They had come to believe that in order for one of them to be free, the other had to die. They discussed it openly, calmly, as though they were working through a math problem, and after much deliberation, Jennifer agreed to make the sacrifice. She would be the one to go, so that June could finally live. In March of 1993, after more than a decade in Broadmoor, the twins were finally approved for transfer to the Caswell Clinic, a lower security facility in Bridgend, Wales. It should have been a moment of hope. But the day before the transfer, Jennifer told Marjorie Wallace something chilling. She said simply that she was going to have to die. Wallace described laughing nervously at the time, unsure of what to make of it, but Jennifer's face had been serious. On the morning of March 9th, the twins boarded a transport van for the journey from Berkshire to Wales. Somewhere along the way, Jennifer slumped against June's shoulder and drifted off. When they arrived at Caswell, Jennifer could not be woken. She was rushed to the Princess of Wales Hospital in Bridgend. By 6:15 that evening, Jennifer Gibbons was dead. She was 29 years old. The cause of death was determined to be acute myocarditis, a sudden and rare inflammation of the heart. There was no evidence of drugs, poison, or foul play. No medical explanation was ever satisfactorily offered for why a 29-year-old woman in otherwise normal health would suddenly die of heart inflammation. June laid a single red rose over Jennifer's body. She later wrote in her diary that her beloved twin sister was dead and that she was free at last, but the loss would always be with her. Jennifer was buried in St. Martin's Cemetery in Haverfordwest beneath a headstone engraved with a poem June had written. It read, "We once were two. We two made one. We no more two. Through life be one. Rest in peace." After Jennifer's death, June began to speak. She gave interviews, communicated clearly and openly, and by all accounts began to live a quiet, independent, and normal life near her family in West Wales. She once said that she thought about Jennifer every day, but that Jennifer had freed her. It was as though the death of one twin had unlocked the life of the other, exactly as they had agreed. There are cases in the history of twins that unsettle people because they seem to suggest that death is not the end, that consciousness or memory or something we don't have a name for can carry over from one life to another. The story of the Pollock twins is perhaps the most famous and most studied of these cases, and even decades later, it remains one that neither believers nor skeptics can fully explain. John and Florence Pollock lived in Hexham, a small market town in Northumberland, England, and by 1957, they had two daughters, Joanna and Jacqueline. Joanna was 11, a creative and somewhat mature girl who loved producing plays and dressing up. Jacqueline was 6, more childlike and dependent, who followed her older sister's lead in most things. Jacqueline had a noticeable scar on her forehead from a childhood accident involving a bucket and a distinctive birthmark on her left hip. The sisters were raised largely by their maternal grandmother, as both John and Florence were busy running a grocery and milk delivery business. On the 7th of May, 1957, both girls were killed. A driver who was later determined to have been acting with suicidal intent drove a car onto the pavement and struck both Joanna and Jacqueline, along with a friend. All 3 children died. The loss devastated the Pollocks. But John, who held an unshakable belief in reincarnation, became convinced that his daughter's souls would return to him. Florence, a devout Catholic, rejected the idea entirely. She wanted to grieve and move forward, not cling to what she considered supernatural wishful thinking. Less than a year after the tragedy, Florence became pregnant. Her doctor predicted a single child. There was no history of twins in either parent's family. But on the 4th of October, 1958, Florence gave birth to twin girls, Jillian and Jennifer. From the beginning, the physical anomalies were hard to ignore. The twins were monozygotic, meaning identical, sharing the same genetic material. Yet Jennifer had 2 birthmarks that Jillian did not. One was on her left hip, in the exact location of the mark that Jacqueline had carried. The other was on her right forehead, near the root of her nose, in precisely the same spot where Jacqueline had the scar from her fall onto the bucket years earlier. Since the twins were genetically identical, genetics could not explain why one had birthmarks, the other did not. Florence noted that Jennifer's forehead mark, like Jacqueline's scar, became more pronounced in cold weather. When the family moved to Whitley Bay shortly after the twins were born, the girls had no exposure to Hexham and no opportunity to learn about their deceased sisters. But when the twins were around 3 years old and beginning to speak coherently, things began to happen that shook even Florence's skepticism. John and Florence brought out a box of toys that had belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline, items that had been stored in the attic since the tragedy. Without prompting, Jillian reached for the doll that had belonged to Joanna and claimed it as her own. Jennifer took the one that had been Jacqueline's. Both girls said the dolls had been gifts from Santa Claus, which was exactly how the original gifts had been given to their older sisters years before. They did not argue over the toys, each seeming to know instinctively which ones belonged to her. Florence began to overhear the twins discussing the accident that killed their sisters. On one occasion, she found Jillian cradling Jennifer's head, saying that the blood was coming out of her eyes, and that was where the car had hit her. John later recalled that when he had gone to identify the bodies, Jacqueline's head had been bandaged above the eyes. Jillian also pointed to the birthmark on Jennifer's forehead and said that was the mark Jennifer got when she fell on a bucket. In her current life, Jennifer had never fallen on a bucket. The accident had happened to Jacqueline. The twins also recognized places they had never been. When the family took a trip to Hexham, the girls pointed out a schoolyard and said they had attended it, though they had never set foot in the town. They correctly identified the location of a park with swings that was not yet visible from where they were standing. On another occasion, when a car engine started suddenly near them in an enclosed alleyway, both girls recoiled in terror, clinging to each other and screaming that the car was coming to get them. Perhaps one of the most striking incidents involved an old smock. Florence had worn it while helping John with the milk delivery business, but had put it away after their daughters died, and she stopped working. One day, when Jennifer was about 4.5, John pulled the smock out to use as a cover-up while painting. Jennifer immediately asked him why he was wearing her mother's coat. When John asked how she knew, Jennifer said that her mother had worn it while delivering milk. Jillian, who as the older sister in the original pairing would not have seen the garment, did not recognize it, which further mirrored the original dynamic between Joanna and Jacqueline. The behavioral parallels continued in subtler ways. Jillian assumed a nurturing older sister role, while Jennifer was more dependent and childlike, mirroring the dynamic between Joanna and Jacqueline. Their physical builds matched their predecessors as well. Jillian was slender like Joanna. Jennifer was stockier like Jacqueline. Jillian had a slightly splay-footed walk, just as Joanna had. When the twins learned to write, Jillian held her pencil correctly from the start, but Jennifer gripped it upright in her fist, exactly as Jacqueline had done, a habit that her teacher had tried and failed to correct before the accident. Jennifer continued holding her pencil this way until she was 7. The renowned psychiatrist, Dr. Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia, investigated the case in 1963 and returned multiple times over the following decades. He documented the twins' statements, examined their birthmarks, and compiled one of the most thorough reincarnation case studies in scientific literature. By the time the twins were around 5, the past life memories began to fade. The references to Joanna and Jacqueline grew less frequent, then stopped entirely. The twins grew up, led normal lives, and when Stevenson met them in their 20s, they remembered nothing of what they had said and done as children. They accepted their parents' account of events with mild curiosity, but showed no strong feelings about it one way or another. Stevenson's conclusion was careful but clear. He called the case highly suggestive of reincarnation, though he stopped short of calling it definitive proof. Skeptics have offered alternative explanations. They suggest John Pollock's deep belief in reincarnation may have unconsciously shaped the twins' behavior, or that the girls may have overheard conversations about their dead sisters and absorbed the details. But the birthmarks remain difficult to dismiss. The specificity of the twins' statements, made at an age when most children are still learning to form sentences, complicates any simple explanation. Whether you believe in reincarnation or not, the Pollock twins represent one of those cases that sits at the border between the explainable and the impossible, daring you to pick a side. Sometimes the connection between twins doesn't manifest as shared silence or echoes of past lives. Sometimes it manifests as shared madness. And there may be no better illustration of that terrifying possibility than what happened on a stretch of the M6 motorway in England in May of 2008, when two Swedish sisters simultaneously lost their grip on reality in a way that defied every attempt at explanation. Ursula and Sabina Eriksson were born on the 3rd of November, 1967, in Sunne, a small town in the Swedish countryside. They grew up alongside an older sister and an older brother in what appeared to be a normal, unremarkable household. Very little is publicly known about their childhood, and there is no documented history of mental illness in either sister before the events of 2008. By their late 30s, their lives had diverged geographically. Ursula had moved to the United States and was living in Bellevue, Washington. Sabina was in Mallow, County Cork, Ireland, with her partner and two young children. They were ordinary women living ordinary lives in different countries, connected by the bond of twinship and little else that anyone could see. On the 16th of May, 2008, Ursula traveled from the United States to visit Sabina in Ireland. Within hours of her arrival, something changed. The sisters abruptly left Ireland without informing anyone, taking a ferry from Dublin to Liverpool in the early hours of May 17th. When they arrived in Liverpool, their first stop was a police station on St. Anne Street, where Sabina reported concerns about the safety of her children, who she had left behind in Ireland with her partner. The police took the report and promised to follow up, and the sisters left. From there, they boarded a National Express coach to London. Almost immediately, the bus driver noticed something was off. The twins were acting strangely, clutching their bags with unusual intensity and refusing to allow anyone to search their luggage. The driver grew suspicious enough to make an unscheduled stop at the Kiel service station on the M6 motorway in Staffordshire and ordered the twins off the bus. Their bags were never searched, and to this day, no one knows what was in them. The manager of the service station also found the women's behavior unsettling and called the police. Officers arrived, spoke briefly with the twins, concluded they seemed harmless, and left. What happened next would be captured on camera by a BBC film crew that was shadowing the Central Motorway Police Group for a reality show called Motorway Cops. After being left at the service station, the twins were spotted on CCTV walking along the central reservation of the M6, the grassy strip separating the two directions of high-speed traffic. Highway agency traffic officers were dispatched, and when they arrived, the situation initially appeared calm. The twins were standing still, smoking cigarettes and chatting with the officers. Sabina was wearing a yellow visor with the slogan, "Time to Believe," printed across it. Then, without any warning, Ursula dropped what she was holding and sprinted directly into the oncoming traffic. An officer lunged for her, managing only to pull her green coat from her body as she ran forward. A lorry traveling at an estimated 56 miles per hour struck her, crushing both her legs. In the same instant, Sabina bolted into the traffic from the other side. She was struck head-on by a Volkswagen Polo at high speed, her body flipping over the hood and windshield before landing in the middle lane. She was knocked unconscious. Both women should have been dead, but they weren't. Ursula, despite having both legs crushed, screamed at the officers and paramedics trying to help her, spitting at them and resisting any attempt at medical aid. Sabina regained consciousness after about 15 minutes and immediately attacked a female police officer, punching her in the face with what witnesses described as superhuman strength. One bystander, a man named Richard Cousins, later said that what he had witnessed was not really human. He said, "You don't get hit by a car going 60 or 70 miles an hour, get thrown into the air, fall unconscious for 10 minutes, and then get up running and try to do it again." 6 officers and several bystanders were needed to restrain Sabina. As she fought, she screamed at them, saying she recognized them, that they were not real, and that they were going to steal her organs. Ursula was airlifted to a hospital with severe injuries. Sabina was arrested and charged with trespass on the motorway and assaulting a police officer. She pleaded guilty to both charges the following day and was sentenced to a single day in custody, which she had already served. Crucially, she was released without a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation. It was a decision that would cost an innocent man his life. Upon her release, Sabina wandered the streets of Stoke-on-Trent, apparently searching for her sister. That evening, she was spotted by 2 men walking a dog. One of them was Glenn Hollinshead, a 54-year-old former RAF serviceman known in his community for his kindness. Sabina approached the men and asked if they knew of any nearby hotels. Feeling sorry for her, Glenn invited her to stay at his home on Duke Street. The following day, while Glenn was helping Sabina try to locate Ursula, something inside Sabina broke again. She took a kitchen knife and stabbed Glenn 5 times. He managed to stagger outside and tell a neighbor that she had stabbed him before collapsing in a nearby alley. He died shortly after. Sabina fled the scene in a frenzy. She struck herself on the head with a hammer, attacked another person with a roof tile, and then threw herself off a 40-foot bridge onto the A50 motorway below, shattering both ankles and fracturing her skull. Somehow, once again, she survived. She was arrested at the hospital on the 6th of June and charged with murder. At her trial in September of 2009, Sabina pleaded guilty to manslaughter with diminished responsibility. When questioned, her only response was no comment. Both the prosecution and the defense agreed that she had been insane at the time of the killing, but had since become sane. Her defense argued that she was a secondary sufferer of folie à deux, a rare psychiatric condition in which delusional beliefs are transmitted from one person to another, typically between people who are closely related. The theory was that Ursula was the primary sufferer, and that her delusions had infected Sabina through their twin bond. The judge, Justice Saunders, described it as one of the most difficult cases he had ever had to sentence. Sabina received 5 years in prison and was released in 2011. The footage from the M6 was never shown in court. Since her release, Sabina is believed to have returned to Scandinavia, and her current whereabouts are unknown. Ursula recovered and returned to her home in Washington state. She was never charged with any crime. Glenn Hollinshead's family never received a satisfying explanation for why he died. No drugs or alcohol were found in either twin's system, which only deepened the mystery. Glenn was remembered by those who knew him as a generous and trusting man, the kind of person who would invite a stranger into his home simply because they needed help. His friend Peter Malloy, who had been with him when they first encountered Sabina, later described the profound guilt he felt for not sensing the danger. The neighborhood on Duke Street where Glenn had lived was left shaken, the residents haunted by the knowledge that a random act of kindness had been repaid with murder. Some investigators and journalists later discovered that police officers at the scene of the motorway incident had initially discussed placing the twins under a Section 136 hold, a provision of the Mental Health Act that allows police to detain someone for psychiatric evaluation. For reasons that have never been fully explained, this did not happen. If it had, Sabina would not have been released the next day, and Glenn Hollinshead would likely still be alive. The case was later featured in a BBC documentary called Madness in the Fast Lane, which aired the motorway footage in full for the first time and attempted to piece together the events of those 2 days in May. The documentary raised more questions than it answered, and the Eriksson case remains one of the most bizarre and deeply troubling incidents in modern British criminal history. The question of what connects twins extends beyond the psychological and into the physical in ways that most of us can barely comprehend. And perhaps no case illustrates this more vividly than the lives and deaths of Chang and Eng Bunker, the men whose very existence gave the world the term Siamese twins. Chang and Eng were born on the 11th of May, 1811, in Meklong, a fishing village in what was then the Kingdom of Siam and is now Thailand. Their father, a fisherman of Chinese descent named T.I., died when they were young, likely during a smallpox epidemic. Their mother Nak raised ducks and children with equal practicality, and she treated her conjoined sons no differently than her other offspring. The twins were connected at the sternum by a flexible band of flesh and cartilage about 5 inches long, through which their livers were fused. As infants, they faced each other, but their mother encouraged them to stretch the connective tissue through exercise until they could stand and walk side by side, with Chang always on the left and Eng on the right. Despite their condition, they were active, social children who ran and played with the other kids in their village. Their lives changed forever in the 1820s when a Scottish merchant named Robert Hunter, who had trading connections with the Siamese government, saw the twins and recognized their commercial potential. In 1829, Hunter and an American sea captain named Abel Coffin departed Siam with the 17-year-old twins, a crew of 18 men, and a Siamese translator. A contract stipulated a 5-year exhibition tour, though rumors circulated that the boys' mother had sold them, a claim that deeply upset Chang and Eng. They arrived in Boston and quickly became a sensation. Audiences were fascinated not just by their physical connection, but by their intelligence, athleticism, and charm. They gave demonstrations of their agility, held conversations in increasingly fluent English, and endured examinations by every physician who could get access to them. In London, Surgeon George Bolton presented his findings to the Royal College of Surgeons, confirming that while their organs functioned independently, the band connecting them shared blood vessels and sensation at its midpoint. After several years of touring, Chang and Eng grew tired of being managed and exploited. They broke with their handlers, took control of their own careers, and eventually decided to settle in America permanently. They became naturalized citizens, adopted the surname Bunker, and in 1839 purchased land in Surry County, North Carolina. In 1843, they married sisters Adelaide and Sarah Yates. The arrangement was logistically complex, but remarkably functional. The brothers maintained 2 separate households on adjacent properties and alternated spending 3 days at each. Chang and Adelaide had 10 children together, while Eng and Sarah had 11. 21 children in total, all born to 2 men who were never more than 5 inches apart. For decades, the arrangement worked, But the Civil War brought financial ruin. The Bunkers, who had become prosperous Southern farmers, lost much of their wealth. Chang was particularly affected. He lost 2 daughters and turned to heavy drinking, a habit that Eng did not share and could not escape. Despite sharing a liver, Eng reportedly never experienced the effects of Chang's drunkenness, a medical curiosity that was never satisfactorily explained. As they aged, the relationship between the brothers deteriorated. In 1870, Chang suffered a stroke that paralyzed the right side of his body, leaving Eng to carry the weight of his brother's damaged frame. They were desperate to be separated, but the doctors they consulted concluded that the operation would be fatal. In 1868, the twins accepted an offer from P.T. Barnum to tour Europe, hoping to rebuild their finances and perhaps find a surgeon bold enough to attempt separation. The tour was a financial success, but no European doctor would risk the procedure either. The brothers returned home bitter, exhausted, and increasingly hostile toward each other. They begged their local physician, Dr. Hollingsworth, to split them apart. Their wives, fearing the risk, talked them out of it. On the night of January 17, 1874, Chang died in his sleep. The cause was almost certainly a cerebral blood clot, the culmination of years of declining health compounded by chronic bronchitis and heavy drinking. Earlier that month, the family physician had urged Chang to stay indoors and warm, but the damage had already been done. When Eng awoke in the early morning hours and realized his brother had stopped breathing, he was paralyzed with terror. According to family accounts, Eng's final words were a request that Chang's cold body be pulled closer to him. One of their sons ran for a doctor, but by the time the physician arrived, Eng too had died. He had survived his twin by approximately 2 to 3 hours. Some accounts suggest that in those final hours, Eng was fully lucid, aware that his death was approaching, and resigned to it. He reportedly said that he had always known he would follow his brother quickly, that the two had entered the world together and would leave it together. The autopsy, performed at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, revealed that the band connecting the brothers contained shared blood vessels, including a significant artery and a thin strip of connected liver tissue. The prevailing theory is that Eng died from blood loss as his circulatory system drained into Chang's lifeless body through their shared vascular connections, though some accounts suggest he died simply of shock, or perhaps of fright, as one contemporary medical report put it, or perhaps of something that medicine has no word for, the biological impossibility of living when the other half of you has stopped. Their conjoined livers remain on display at the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia to this day, preserved in a glass jar as a permanent exhibit, alongside a plaster death cast of their torsos. Chang and Eng Bunker lived for 62 years, fathered 21 children, married sisters, built farms, endured a war, and died within hours of each other. Even with modern medical technology, the question of whether they could have been safely separated remains a subject of debate, though most experts believe it would be possible today. If the Bunker twins showed the world that two people can be bound together in the most physical sense imaginable, the story of the Jim twins proved that the bond between twins can extend far beyond the body. It can reach into the most intimate corners of a person's life and shape choices, preferences, relationships, and even names in ways that no one has ever been able to explain. Jim Lewis and Jim Springer were born in 1940 in Ohio to a 15-year-old mother who was unable to care for them. At just 4 weeks old, the infant boys were separated and placed with two different adoptive families. One went to the Lewis family in Lima, Ohio. The other went to the Springers in Piqua, about 40 miles away. Both families were told that the child they were adopting had a twin, but neither knew what had become of the other boy. And here is where the story begins to defy every rational explanation. Both families, entirely independently and with no contact between them, named their adopted son James. Both boys went by Jim. As children, both had a beloved dog named Toy. Both had a brother named Larry. In school, both excelled at math and woodworking, but struggled with spelling. Both grew up to work in law enforcement, one as a security guard and the other as a deputy sheriff. Both drove Chevrolets. Both smoked Salem cigarettes. Both were habitual nail-biters. Both developed the same type of tension headache beginning at age 18. The parallels in their personal lives were even more astonishing. Both married women named Linda. Both divorced their Lindas and then remarried women named Betty. Jim Lewis named his first son James Allen. Jim Springer named his first son James Allen. The only difference was a single letter in the middle name. Both men vacationed at the same beach in Florida, despite having no knowledge of the other's travel preferences. Both built white benches around trees in their yards. When asked to draw a picture during testing, both drew nearly identical images. Jim Lewis had known from childhood that he had a twin. Jim Springer had been told his twin had died. It wasn't until Lewis was 37 that he began searching. In 1977, he obtained his brother's contact information through an Ohio courthouse. The two spoke on the phone, and on February 9, 1979, they met face to face for the first time since they were infants. They were 39 years old, 6 feet tall, and weighed exactly 180 pounds each. Their case immediately attracted the attention of Dr. Thomas Bouchard at the University of Minnesota, who was launching a landmark study on twins raised apart. The Minnesota Twin Family Study, which ran from 1979 to 1999 and eventually examined 137 pairs of twins, would become one of the most important studies in the history of behavioral genetics. The Jim twins were its most famous subjects. When Bouchard ran brainwave tests and personality assessments on the pair, the results came back virtually identical. Their medical histories were nearly interchangeable. Bouchard himself was staggered by the findings, telling reporters that if someone else had brought him the data, he would not have believed it. The probability of two people independently being given the same name was not that rare on its own, he noted. But when you compound the coincidences, they become extremely unlikely very quickly. The Jim twins appeared on the Johnny Carson Show and the Phil Donahue Show, where their reunion was broadcast to a national audience. But beyond the media attention, their case had profound implications for the nature versus nurture debate. If two people with identical DNA could live virtually identical lives, despite being raised in completely different environments, what did that say about the power of genetics? How do you explain the names of their wives, the names of their dogs, the names of their sons? There is no gene for marrying a woman named Linda, no chromosome that dictates you should vacation at a particular beach in Florida. And yet the parallels were there, stacked one on top of another, impossible to dismiss, and equally impossible to explain. Some researchers have theorized that genetics influences personality, temperament, and preference to such a degree that people with identical DNA will be drawn to similar choices, even in the absence of shared environment. Others have suggested something more mysterious, a kind of quantum entanglement of identity, where two people who began as a single fertilized egg maintain a connection that transcends physical proximity. Dr. Nancy Siegel, an evolutionary psychologist who participated in the Minnesota study, and later wrote a book about it called Born Together, Reared Apart, cataloged the parallels in meticulous detail. She noted that the Jim twins were far from the only remarkable pair in the study, but they remained the most famous because of the sheer density of coincidences. The study itself examined 137 pairs of twins over 20 years and produced more than 170 individual studies on different medical and psychological characteristics. One finding was that about 70% of variation in IQ across the twin population could be attributed to genetic differences, with only 30% due to environment. Personality traits, religious attitudes, and even social preferences showed stronger genetic influence than anyone had expected. Jim Springer reportedly told researchers that he had always felt an emptiness, a sense of something missing throughout his entire life. Meeting his twin didn't just fill that emptiness, it explained it. The Jim twins didn't solve the nature versus nurture debate. If anything, they made it more complicated, more humbling, and more unsettling. The question of what it means to be a twin takes on an entirely different dimension when it enters a courtroom. Identical twins share the same DNA, and in a legal system that increasingly relies on genetic evidence to establish guilt, this creates a problem that has, on more than one occasion, brought the machinery of justice to a grinding halt. The cases that follow demonstrate just how deeply the twin paradox can undermine the search for truth. In the summer of 2003, in Edgewater, Colorado, a 30-year-old mother named Heather DeWild went to her estranged husband's home to sign a check and collect health insurance cards for their 2 young children. She brought the children with her because she didn't want to be alone with her soon-to-be ex-husband, Daniel DeWild, whom she was just days from officially divorcing. Daniel shared the house with his identical twin brother, David, and David's girlfriend, Roseanne. Heather walked in and never walked out. Daniel told Heather's family that she had left the kids with him to go shopping and never returned. Her father, Dave Springer, a veteran Denver police officer, knew immediately that something was wrong. Heather would never have abandoned her children. 2 weeks later, Heather's car was found. A month after that, her body was discovered in a shallow grave alongside a canyon road, bound with ropes, wrapped in plastic and trash bags, her face covered with a mask of duct tape. Her body was so badly decomposed that dental records were needed to identify her. The medical examiner could not determine the exact cause of death, though she had suffered skull fractures and extensive facial bone damage. Everything pointed to Daniel DeWild and his twin brother, but there was a devastating problem for investigators. No physical evidence connected either brother specifically to the crime. They shared the same DNA. Any genetic evidence found on or near Heather could belong to either twin, and there was no way to tell which. What investigators would eventually learn was that the brothers had planned the murder carefully, studying television crime shows for tips on how to avoid detection. They used a new disposable razor to cut the ropes, knowing that new razors couldn't be traced. They wore long sleeves and double layers of gloves to prevent any of their hair, fibers, or DNA from ending up on the body. They had learned these techniques from watching shows like CSI. A trained police dog detected decomposition scent in David's Suburban, but no conclusive physical evidence was recovered from the vehicle either. The case went cold for nearly a decade. Then, in 2011, a grand jury indicted all 3, Daniel, David, and Roseanne, for first-degree murder. The break came in August of 2012, when David DeWild's conscience finally cracked. He cooperated with investigators and confessed that Daniel had killed Heather in the garage while David helped dispose of the body. He described how Daniel had planned the killing after being ordered to pay child support, and how the three of them had maintained a pact of silence for nearly 9 years. At trial, the jury convicted Daniel on lesser charges, but deadlocked on first-degree murder, unable to agree beyond a reasonable doubt which twin had actually delivered the fatal blows. Daniel eventually accepted a plea deal for second-degree murder and was sentenced to 74 years. David pleaded guilty to conspiracy and received 12 years. He was released on parole in 2020. The investigator who finally broke the case, Russ Boatwright, made an observation that cut to the heart of the twin paradox. He said that DNA would say the two men were identical twins, but that David was a very different person than Daniel. The DeWilde case was not the only time identical twins created an unsolvable riddle for law enforcement. In Georgia in 2008, a school teacher named Jenny Coleman was carjacked and fatally shot while waiting to pick up her daughter near a transit station in Gwinnett County. Investigators found a cigarette butt in her stolen car and ran the DNA through the national database. The match came back to a convicted felon named Donald Smith. Detectives arrested him, believing they had their man, but Donald insisted he was innocent and said his identical twin brother, Ronald, was the real killer. Because identical twins share the same DNA, the genetic evidence that had led police to Donald was equally applicable to Ronald. It could have been either of them. It was a nightmare scenario for prosecutors. Fortunately, there was one form of evidence that could distinguish the brothers. Despite sharing identical DNA, identical twins do not share identical fingerprints. The prints lifted from Coleman's stolen car matched Ronald Smith, not Donald. Cell phone records also placed Ronald near the scene. Confronted with the evidence, Ronald eventually confessed, saying the gun had a hair trigger and that it had gone off accidentally during the carjacking. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life plus 25 years. Donald was exonerated. But the case laid bare a disturbing truth. If there had been no fingerprints, if the only evidence had been DNA, an innocent man might have gone to prison for his brother's crime, and the guilty man might have walked free. In a world that increasingly treats DNA as the gold standard of forensic evidence, the existence of identical twins represents a crack in the foundation that the legal system has yet to fully address. In France, cases involving identical twins and DNA evidence have continued to emerge, with courts sometimes unable to determine which twin is guilty. In one case, twins shared clothes, phone numbers, and even identity documents, making it nearly impossible for prosecutors to establish individual culpability. These cases have prompted legal scholars to call for the development of new forensic techniques, including epigenetic analysis, that could potentially distinguish between genetically identical individuals by examining chemical modifications to their DNA that accumulate over a lifetime. But for now, the twin paradox remains one of the most unsettling loopholes in criminal justice. The final story in this collection takes us to a small house in San Diego, California, in the late 1970s, where two identical twin girls lived in conditions that most people would call squalid and most experts would call devastating. Their names were Grace and Virginia Kennedy, though they would become known to the world by the names they called each other, Poto and Cabengo. Grace and Virginia were born in 1970 in Columbus, Georgia. Their father, Tom Kennedy, was an accountant from Georgia who had met their mother, Christine, a German woman, at a dance festival in Munich while he was stationed overseas with the Air Force. After marrying, the couple moved to the United States, eventually settling in San Diego. Christine's mother, Paula Kunert, a reclusive German-speaking woman, moved in with them. The household was multilingual in the loosest sense of the word. Tom spoke only English. Christine and her mother spoke primarily German. No one in the house spoke both languages well, and no one spoke much to the twins at all. As infants, Grace and Virginia suffered seizures that led their parents to fear permanent intellectual disability. Rather than seeking treatment or stimulation for the girls, the family did the opposite. They kept the twins indoors, away from other children, away from the outside world, under the watch of their grandmother, who largely left them to their own devices. The girls had virtually no contact with anyone outside their home and received almost no verbal interaction from the adults around them. They were not enrolled in school. They were not taken to parks or playgrounds. They existed in a bubble of neglect, surrounded by adults who had essentially given up on them. In this isolation, something remarkable happened. The twins began to talk, but not in any language anyone recognized. They developed their own system of communication, a rapid staccato stream of syllables that sounded to outsiders like a tape recorder playing at triple speed. They called each other Poto and Kabengo, and they spoke to each other constantly, animatedly, with the kind of enthusiasm and emotional range that suggested a full and functioning language. Their speech was characterized by extreme speed, blurred word boundaries, and inconsistent pronunciation. Linguists would later document up to 16 different ways the twins articulated the phrase potato salad. Their mother and grandmother, when they could be bothered to listen, assumed the girls were simply babbling. It wasn't until 1977, when the twins were 7 years old, that anyone outside the family realized something extraordinary was happening. The girls were brought to Children's Hospital in San Diego for evaluation after proving too cognitively advanced for programs designed for the developmentally disabled. Speech therapists at the hospital were stunned. The twins showed no proficiency in standard English, yet they communicated with each other with fluency, emotional nuance, and what appeared to be grammatical structure. The clinic's director, Chris Hagen, described their speech as sounding like a fast-forward tape, with occasional recognizable words jumping out. Psycholinguists Richard Meyer and Alyssa Newport from the nearby University of California campus were brought in to study and decode the girls' speech. What they found was both more mundane and more tragic than the media wanted to hear. The twins' private language was not a wholly invented linguistic system. It was, at its core, heavily distorted English mixed with German influences absorbed from their mother and grandmother, spoken at such extraordinary speed and with such unusual pronunciation that it had become unintelligible to everyone but the two of them. Words like pintu for pencil, neeps for knife, and ho-ox for orange were traceable to their English and German roots once slowed down and analyzed. Around 50 complex words or phrases were documented, most of which were severe mispronunciations of everyday terms. But the question of what the language was mattered less than the question of how it came to exist. The answer was neglect. The twins had been deprived of meaningful adult interaction during the most critical period of language development. Their father had largely written them off as intellectually impaired. Their mother was struggling to communicate in a language she herself had not fully mastered. Their grandmother, their primary caretaker, was a recluse who barely spoke at all. In the absence of any reliable linguistic model, Grace and Virginia had done what human beings are wired to do. They had built language from whatever scraps were available to them, and they had built it together, creating something that was uniquely theirs, a private world made of sound. The media descended on the Kennedy twins with the force of a hurricane. The story of the twins who invented their own language was featured in the Washington Post, Time magazine, and the New York Times. Film rights were offered. French filmmaker Jean-Pierre Gorin traveled to San Diego and produced a documentary called Poto and Kabengo, which captured the twins' hypnotic speech patterns and the bleak domestic landscape that had produced them. For a brief period, Grace and Virginia were bigger than the Loch Ness Monster, as one journalist put it. Everyone wanted to study them, interview them, or exploit them. But beneath the media frenzy was a family in crisis. The Kennedys were financially struggling, and Tom Kennedy, who had feared the worst about his daughter's intelligence, now found himself confronted with the reality that it was not disability that had held them back, but the environment he and his family had created. The twins were enrolled in separate speech therapy programs and sent to different schools, where their private language was systematically replaced with standard English. The treatment worked in the narrowest sense. The twins learned to speak English, but the private language that had been their sole means of connection to each other and to the world was erased in the process. What happened to Grace and Virginia afterward is one of the saddest epilogues in the history of twin studies. They never fully caught up. The critical window for language acquisition had been partially closed by the time intervention came, and the years of isolation had left lasting developmental damage. A follow-up report from around the year 2000 found that both women were still experiencing speech difficulties and cognitive delays. Grace, who had achieved a somewhat higher level of functioning, was working at a McDonald's, cleaning tables and mopping floors. Virginia was doing assembly line work at a job training center. The filmmaker Gorin had predicted this outcome decades earlier. He said he had gotten the sense that at the end of the story, everybody in the Kennedy family would be left high and dry. The story of Poto and Kabengo is not a story about the mystery of twin language or the marvel of childhood invention. It is a story about what happens when children are abandoned to silence, when the adults who are supposed to nurture them instead turn away. The twins did the best they could with what they were given, which was almost nothing. They built a world from fragments, and for a while, it was enough. But the world they built was never meant to be permanent, and when it was taken from them, nothing adequate was put in its place. Every case in this collection asks the same question from a different angle. What does it mean to share your existence with another person so completely that the boundaries between you begin to dissolve? Whether it's through silence, through memory, through madness, through flesh, through coincidence, or through the language you invent when no one else will speak to you, the bond between twins remains one of the most powerful and most poorly understood forces in human experience. Science has given us theories. Psychology has given us diagnoses. But the twins themselves, the ones who lived these stories, seem to suggest that there is something operating beneath the surface that none of our tools can quite reach. If you found these stories as fascinating and unsettling as I did, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. It helps more people find these stories, and it helps me keep bringing them to you. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and sleep well.